inside the secret factory in China where Apple iPhones and iPads are made.
She's a 27-year-old mother of two, and she makes a living trimming aluminum burrs from those iconic iPad logos. But since it would take 3 months' salary to buy an iPad of her own, this is the first time she's ever seen the final product. Her kids live 2 hours away, and she can afford to see them just once a month. But this is typical for most of the 235,000 who work in this one Foxconn complex. Many leave distant villages where families live in rooms like this.
How do you stay warm?
To share a dorm room like this with 7 strangers. They spend 12 hours a day in the factory with 2 one-hour meal breaks. And ever since 18 Foxconn workers jumped from these buildings, the suicide nets are still in place, just in case. And if Foxconn ever needs more workers, there are always crowds of applicants like this, all hoping to earn a wage Americans haven't seen since the 1950s.
Well, I think the most important question in political economy is compared to what? So what happens in central or western China if Western manufacturing concerns pull out and go somewhere else? What's their next best option? And the useful thing, I think, about taking a property-centric and an economy-centric point of view of this is that you leave those people to make their own decisions. So even though they're not making decisions based from a decision menu that would be pleasing to us as, 21st century Americans, not only the richest people in the world, but the richest people who've ever lived in all of human history, who have just practically infinite choices, even if we're poor by our local standards, you have to take into account the actual realities. There was a case study, I think it was involving a shoe factory. It might have been Nike, I'm not 100% sure it was, where there was a human rights campaign about them using, it wasn't really child labor, but it was people in their late teens, and they shut the factory down. Mostly had been girls working there. So they came 2 years later to figure out what had happened, and most of them had, either through their own choice or through coercion, been put into prostitution, which was the next best choice. So we had a great human rights victory by getting them out of these horrible sweatshops that put them in a much worse condition than they were. The argument for markets isn't really about competition as much as it is about cooperation. But what we do in modern market institutions is that we enable cooperation on a species-wide level around the world, which produces just remarkable results. We talk about, should we redistribute wealth in some way? Should we transfer assets from these people who have a lot to those people who have less? All of that assumes that you've got a lot of assets to work with. And that's why it's important, I think, to understand the role of profit in this, because, it wasn't food stamps or price supports or anything else that made food plentiful in the Western world. Is that people invested in agriculture. They cleared more farmland. They put GPSs in tractors. Monsanto invented better seeds. And so you've got very, very plentiful food. In the 1950s, the typical family spent about half of its disposable income on groceries. Now it's about 7%, 8%. Things like shoes used to be, relatively speaking, extraordinarily expensive. Travel used to be such a rarefied good that the term jet set still survives into our economy when you can get a flight somewhere for $49. And not only middle-class people, but genuinely poor people can afford air travel, at least from time to time. So when you've got a system that builds this much prosperity, that you can have the conversation about what do we do with all this extra wealth we have, you don't want to, as a solution to that, come up with a political system that makes you less well off and gives you less in the way of resources to work with. Which, again, that gets pretty slippery. You can get into some very difficult situations with that. I think you could make a case, and I'm a free trade guy who believes in letting people go where they want to, but that doing business in the People's Republic of China is always morally complicated, even if you're not doing anything that we would normally think of as unethical, because you are, by your presence and your generation of value and your generation and your investment of capital, helping to support what is one of the most awful and oppressive and terrible governments in the world.